Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here on this rainy day. I think it's great to see people using the space, so everybody's so welcome to be here. The title of my talk today, New Insights on the Spatial Dynamics of Plant Invasions in Urban Parks in the Pacific Northwest, the case of English holly. I really want to emphasize that this research would not have been possible with the support from UW Bothell through this grant, and also the support of the students who were so critical, especially in the data collection process. Neil is here, he's part of the research team. Jackie Fiola is also part of the team, but she was not able to be here today. But this is important work that students actually worked very hard to put together, so I'm very proud of them. And I just wanted to talk about some of these preliminary results that we were able to obtain with the data that they collected. I helped also with the data collection, but most of that data collection aspect of this was done by students. So I just want to emphasize that. Right, so this is a very brief outline of my talk today. I can group this maybe in three chunks. One is, I'm going to provide some background about the research. I'm going to talk about the significance of this research. I'm going to explain a little bit about the methods, the data that we collected, some preliminary results, and again, just bear with me, it's very preliminary. We just started the data collection phase, so we're trying to make sense of the data. I'm going to share some of those results with you today, and then some future research avenues that we can take this research. But before we start with this, I think it's important to mention how I got involved with this research. And I think that also is an acknowledgement to Dave Stock, who's here. He started this research in the early, 2000s when you moved here to Washington, back to Washington State, and he did all this research. Yeah. And then he did a lot of this, again, data collection early in between, I think, 2012 and 2014, 15, 16, with an army of students. And he has a really amazing data set with a lot of information about English holly. And I participated in that project early on to help, again, to make sense of the spatial context of where these plants were found. And we collaborate on a couple of reports for parks and also a couple of research papers. And that's kind of the base of the research that we are going to be presenting today. Another aspect of my research that I think is relevant in this context of English, the invasion of English holly, is my interest in learning more about the patterns and processes that are that contribute to what we see currently in the landscapes. So I'm a geographer. My background is in geography. I'm a human environment geographer who looks at the intersections between the human agency and the impacts of that human agency on the environment. And invasive species research kind of falls at that intersection too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that intersection also between humans and the environment through this type of research on invasive species. Okay, so in general, and I think this is kind of a very broad type of generalization about why are we studying invasive species. I think there's a few reasons for that. Well, I think one of those reasons is because of this need to mitigate the negative impacts of invasive species on natural native ecosystems, particularly impacts on biodiversity, impacts on ecological services of these native ecosystems, impacts on soils, water, and also, in addition to that, on economic prosperity. So we know, and there's a lot of research that focus specifically on those impacts of invasive species on the economies of societies. If you think about the impacts on agriculture, the impacts on forestry, those are important questions, those are important aspects to look at, and they have also an impact on the financial, economic well-being of society. So now from a theoretical perspective, I also think that invasive species provide this type of natural experiments that may offer insights on how things work, right? This type of ecological processes that we can learn from, and they contribute to a spatial ecological theory. They also contribute to these aspects of biogeography, biogeography is this subfield in geography that looks at the distribution of a species and how those ranges change over time because of different types of stressors, like, for example, climate change, right? So there's a lot of research in biogeography that looks at those changes in ranges of the distributions of different species because of this type of environmental factors. So the literature on invasive plant species has concentrated mostly on the analysis of this type of environmental conditions, the spatial context of where these invasions are happening. So when we think about the environment as a series of filters that could also allow or discourage plant establishment, then it's interesting to see what are those filters, what are those environmental factors that contribute to those type of patterns. So another bunch of research has focused on the life histories of this type of invasive organisms, demographic conditions, for example, in the context of plants, how old they are, so that we can get a sense of when they were introduced and the conditions before and after the introduction of these species, the biological characteristics of the plants, and also genetics, right? How are these plants evolving and adapting to these new conditions? So particularly speaking about the models and the approaches to study this type of processes, there has been a lot of research on using this type of species distribution models, which are basically mathematical quantitative approaches that can help us estimate those relationships between the presence of these organisms and their context and the environmental context. So this type of approach is actually trying to figure out what are these factors that are the most important that actually allow the dispersion of a particular plant species or organism. So species distribution models consider the environment as a series of filters that prevent unsuited plants from establishing, maturing, reproducing, and dispersing, but they also give us a sense of the suitability of the environment to host a particular species. In the last 3 decades, starting in the late 1990s until now, there has been a lot of developments in the types of species distribution models that are available, and there are many different types of methods that can be applied to learn about this type of interactions. In this talk, I'm going to be emphasizing on this particular type of model that is called maximum entropy, or MaxEnt, which is a model that allows us to estimate the spatial distribution of the species, in this case, English holly, Ilex aquifolium, and identify those type of factors that contribute to the dispersion of this species. Now I'm going to explain some of these characteristics of English holly before we actually jump into the details of the modeling approach and our findings. So I think it's important to keep these conditions and characteristics in mind and why doing this type of research is important. So as we know, English holly, and probably many of you already know this, but English holly is native from near to Europe, Great Britain specifically, Northern Africa, parts of Asia. It was is a evergreen shrub. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the leaves are very hard, very sturdy. They are leathery. They can tolerate a wide range of soils and different types of soil conditions, including salty habitats. They are also resilient to those type of harsh environments. And an important characteristic of holly is that they're also shade tolerant, so they do very well in areas with very little amount of light. So I think that's why they're very successful in the forest here in the Pacific Northwest. Is a dioecious plant, so that means that it has both sexes. So it reproduces sexually through berries and also vegetatively, through the root system. If you leave a stump, if you cut English holly, it's very likely that it's gonna, at some point, it's gonna resprout. So it's actually hard to manage because it's a very resilient plant. If it's very young, it's easy to pull it out from the ground, but once it turned into a bigger tree, you actually need heavy machinery to remove it or cut it. and then treat it with some kind of herbicide to actually kill it. So it's very resilient. So as I said, both sexes are needed for pollination. So the males produce the pollen that is transferred to female flowers, and then they produce the berries. The berries, pollination happen in the spring, actually during this time of the year when English holly blooms, and then the berries are actually ripe and ready by the end of the fall season, and they actually last all the way through the winter. So it's a good food resource for some birds, particularly that rely on English holly for nourishment, especially during the winter season. So it can grow again from small plants, a few inches tall, to very high, tall trees of 50 feet tall trees. And according to research, it has become naturalized in the Pacific Northwest. Now, how does this happen? I think that's an important question to ask. How is this here, and what is the state of English holly dispersion here in Washington State? So holly was introduced in Washington State in the late 1860s as an ornamental plant. It was very popular. People really liked the plant for different aesthetic characteristics, also some uses around, to make crafts, and it's still used in that sense nowadays. Also used for fence lines. I think that's a tradition that came from Great Britain that is heavily used, English holly, to make fence lines to keep livestock and animals in certain areas, because when it grows, it forms this type of dense thickets of branches, and since this has spiny leaves, it's really hard to actually go through. It keeps people and animals away from those areas where you have holly. So it was very popular, and people loved it. And in the 1920s, this particular organization, the Washington State Society for the Conservation of Wildflowers and Tree Planting, they actually promoted the dispersion of holly. And they promoted planting holly in state parks, in parks, in city parks, urban parks, and also areas outside the Seattle area, and the greater Seattle area. So in the 1930s, these planting efforts actually scaled down and ceased, but a lot of seedlings were already planted. More than 30,000 seeds were already dispersed. And most of this planting was done by kids, by children from this type of groups. That's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, some other groups around the city. And it was very economically successful too. So by 1950s, there were, the 1950s, 1960s, there were over 200 holly farms in Washington State. And people were actually very excited about this. And nowadays, I think there's only 3 to 5 holly farms, active farms in Washington State, but it was very popular in the 1950s. Now, what are some of the ecological impacts of English holly? So as we probably know, the berries are not edible by humans, but birds, so they're toxic to us and toxic to pets. But robins really like those, and probably robins are one of the main dispersers of holly seeds nowadays. It has a deep, aggressive root system that can outcompete native species, native trees and shrubs, and actually get the nutrients that are necessary for other species to succeed. So there is that strong competition with holly. Can form this type of dense thickets that also can affect the growth of native vegetation, trees and shrubs. So that's a map that I got from this website called iNaturalist. Have you guys used that website before? So yeah, there is over 30,000 records of holly along the Pacific coast. And as you can see, there's some concentrations in the Northwest, right? But doesn't mean there's, it's all along the coast of the United States that you have that impact of holly. And these are just observations from people, citizen scientists, observers, ecologists, and So another impact is, the leaves of holly, they produce this flammable vapor when heated, so they can ignite easily, and they also may increase fire risk. They can take large areas, suppressing germination, the growth of native trees, particularly Douglas fir, red cedar, maples, and shrubs, and there are some other smaller species that can be affected by holly. So these impacts, of course, have some sort of consequence on the native biodiversity. They reduce ecosystem functions and services. They alter forest succession with the implications for habitat values. And also, going back to the idea of economic impacts, it can really affect timber production, the timber industry. Okay, so what are the research questions that lead this research? So our questions are, what are the environmental factors that affect the probability of the presence of English holly in urban forests in the Pacific Northwest? And what are the special patterns of spread at the local level? So if we are able to answer this type of questions locally, then the next question is, can we extrapolate these findings to the region, right? And that's something that we want to also test at some point with more data. But for this presentation, we're going to stay local. We're going to stay local here at Kenmore State Park, where we collected the data. And our results actually refer to the local site. So this is our study site. The study area is here in Kenmore State Park. If you walk 5 minutes from here, you will get to where we were collecting the data. Specifically is this shape over here that looks like a gooey duck. That's our study site. And it's an area of about 12.5 hectares, so relatively small. And we collected the data on the presence of holly. In other words, we went there to map the trees with GPS or GNSS devices. We measure the height, we measure the diameters, and the location, right? Those were the three main types of parameters that we collected. In addition to other information that we collected via sensors, via remote sensing and also local sensors. All right, so just to give you a little bit of a sense of this type of modeling approaches that are available now to do this type of analysis. So when you model or when you try to understand the distribution of a species, the common approach is to rely on what we call presence data. In other words, where they are located. Other studies also include absence data. So they specifically look for areas that don't have the species. That's what we call absence data. So this type of model usually lies in this type of information, presence and absence data, where you have the species and where you don't have the species, right? So when you have the data representing those type of conditions, presence and absence, there are some modeling frameworks, some mathematical approaches that allow us to get a sense of what's the probability of finding this particular species or not finding it, right? So this type of modeling approach is what we call logistic regression or logistic regression model that allow us to model exactly that, the presence and the absence of a particular species. So Dave and I published a paper in 2015 that talks more about this type of logistic regression approach when modeling presence and absence because of the way that Dave's team actually collected the data. They actually did a very extensive research. They look every square foot in the area for holly, and they found all the holly plants, and they were actually very, very certain that they didn't map the holly plants, there was no holly plants there, right? So we use this type of modeling framework to do that. So if you are interested in that type of work, there's that research that we published that year. Now, when you only collect presence data, so in other words, when you have incomplete data sets, right? And there are different reasons why this could happen. What could be the resources? You may not have enough resources to spend too much time in the field, actually looking inch by inch for the particular species. So there are other types of frameworks that kind of are adapted to those type of conditions when your data is not perfect, when you have, or the data is not complete, is incomplete data. So in this case, for example, what Neil and Jackie and I did, we went there, we tried to look for all the holly plants in our survey area, but it's likely that we missed some, right? Because it was not an extensive survey. We also had limited resources, limited amount of time. So we were limited to collecting what we actually were able to see in a relatively short amount of time. So when that's the case, when you have presence-only data, there are different types of approaches like this one, right, that we call maximum entropy. Because these other methods, like logistic regression, won't work with this type of data sets, or they won't work as well, right? Now, maximum entropy, the short term is maxent, is a general purpose machine learning type of approach. So, but it's also a statistical approach. So it kind of combines these two worlds in mathematics, statistics, and machine learning to produce an output that could be interpreted as a probability map, right? So it's again is a system, is a hybrid system that uses aspect of machine learning, deep learning, and also statistics. So it relies on this type of mathematical framework that is called elastic net, that combines these two different types of regression models, right, Ridge and Lasso. So that's kind of the statistical aspect of this. So it has two components. One that is called the entropy component. In this context of maxent, entropy is a measure of dispersion, is a measurement of dispersiveness. And what the software or the model tries to do is maximize the distribution. So it's trying to create a uniform pattern for the distribution. So that's this idea of dispersion, right? So how the species is dispersed over the landscape. So it tries to maximize the extent of that dispersion. And it also relies on a series of constraints. And in this case, constraints are these biophysical factors that are going to have some kind of impact, some kind of effect on where the plant is going to be, right? So maxent kind of incorporates these two important characteristics of dispersion and also environmental factors. Another advantage of using maxent is that it accounts for sampling biases. So for example, in our case, although we try to look for holly in the holly study area, most of our sampling actually happened along trails, right? Because they were more accessible, they were easy to see from a particular trail. So there is that bias. So we actually found a lot of holly plants along the trails, but that doesn't mean that the holly tree or the holly species is not somewhere else in the park, right? But with maxent, you can account for those type of biases and applies this particular type of method that is called spatial thinning to remove some of those data and have a less reduce this problem of a spatial autocorrelation, which is areas that are closer together are going to look more alike, right? Which is a problem in the statistics because things are correlated, right? And they're spatially correlated. So this process allows us to remove some of those biases in how we collected the data. So again, I'm not going to go through the details of the mathematical model, but again, that output that a maxent produces can be understood, interpreted as a suitability value. So in other words, what the maxent produces is a map or a spatial layer that says, okay, these areas are more suitable than these ones, right? You can think of this as a range of categories from 1 to 10, right? 1 being very unsuitable and 10 being very suitable. But in addition to that suitability value is transformed into a probability using this type of mathematical transformation, which is, again, a logistic model, right? So we transform those suitability numbers into probabilities using what we call the maxent function, right? Which is explained there. So enough with the math behind this. I think it's important to look at the results. And, but again, so these are the locations of holly. These are some of the locations that we mapped, that the students mapped using a GPS receiver. So we mapped 86 observations, presence-only data, right? That's we did these vegetation surveys in 2023 using different type of measurements, GPS measurements, using also GNSS measurements. As I don't know if you're familiar with global navigation satellite systems of GPS, they don't have great accuracy if you don't apply some kind of post-processing technique to fix the errors associated with those measurements. So we were able to correct the GPS measurements to an accuracy of less than 1 meter. So the locations that you see there have that level of accuracy of less than 1 meter, which is not possible to achieve with a regular GPS receiver. The ones that you probably have on your phones won't be able to get to this level of accuracy. So we actually did some, buy some equipment with the grant money to be able to get this equipment, but in the meantime, before we actually got the GPS equipment, we also did some surveying using some traditional techniques, using compass and tape measures, a little bit more traditional ways of finding locations. So in addition to location, we also measure DBH, which is the diameter above the breast height, at the breast height, and also the height of the tree, so that we can have an estimate, an idea of how old the trees are. So we're in the process of figuring out how old these trees are, right? Using some of the data that they've collected, in the past. Since we have a lot of data, we can actually come up with some precise estimations about the age of the trees that we mapped this time. Now, what are the explanatory variables and how we are characterizing the environment? What type of environmental conditions are we going to look at? So we can group them in different categories. So for example, elevation and topographic conditions, right? So that's one group of data, data that we were able to derive. So for that, to characterize elevation topographic conditions, we use unmanned aerial systems data. So that's drone imagery, that you can derive very precise information at a very high spatial resolution, and LiDAR data, which is another type of remote sensing technique, remote sensing instrument that relies on laser measurements to determine what the elevations are, and also characteristics of the canopy, right, of the different spaces, different landscapes. So we also measure some of these forest conditions, for example, the vertical height of trees, to get a sense of, again, the structure of the forest. We also use drone imagery and LiDAR data for that characterization. We also measure atmospheric conditions, particularly temperature characteristics and light intensity. So we placed 24 sensors, hobo sensors that measure that those conditions, and we collected data for where they're still there. So if at some point you walk on the trails, you will see the sensors mounted on the trees. I'll show you a picture of one of those in a little bit. But we collected data every 30 minutes. So we have thousands of records, just summarizing temperature and light conditions on a daily basis throughout the whole year. So one of the challenges was how do we process this data, because we have just a lot of information. And also we measure soil conditions, ammonia levels, like nitrogen levels, phosphorus and potassium, to have a sense of the nutrients, soil nutrient content. And also land cover conditions, composition, what type of forest communities we find, evergreen, deciduous communities, and also human-made features using GPS data and also GIS, so derived information using a geographic information system. Right, so this is just some pictures. So this is Jackie. She's not here today, but she helped us initially with the mounting of the sensors. These are the hobo sensors that we put on the trees. They measure temperature and luminosity Again, I said we have 24 of those sensors collecting data as we speak. We also did the soil analysis using a photometer soil tester. This uses lights, is a sensor, is an instrument that uses light to measure nutrient concentrations. And these are the different types of information that we were able to generate. Again, all these different factors are translated into maps, right? Maps, layers, spatial layers that we can use in a modeling framework like Maxent, right? So distance, for example, with the trails information, we were able to derive these variables: distance to trails, how close you are to a trail. Distance to forest edge, we can delimit the forest edges and also calculate how far you are from the forest edge. Land cover types, height, tree heights, again, derived from drone imagery, mean monthly light intensity, mean monthly temperatures, concentrations of nutrients, topographic characteristics, slope aspects. So all this was generated, and they were all these factors that we consider as environmental factors. Another important aspect or kind of connection with AI, with artificial intelligence, is here, the way that the methods that we use to classify our drone imagery. So we use, this type of libraries that are specifically designed to work with raster data, with pixel data. So, and they provide really, really good results with very high accuracies as well. I just wanted to mention that. That's another connection with how these modeling frameworks are kind of evolving, continuously evolving. Right now, machine learning, those type of artificial intelligence methods are becoming very popular. Sometimes I think people are overusing them for many different reasons, but they are very helpful, particularly in this type of conditions when you have a lot of data you want to analyze, and they really help kind of look at identify patterns, right? Identify conditions. So these are just some of the results of the modeling aspect. So in order to evaluate the outcomes, right, the outputs of Maxent, we rely on this type of graphs. This is what we call the receiver operating characteristic curve, or ROC curve. And how you interpret this is basically, this is the outcome of the model, right, this line. And the closer this line is to the vertical axis, the better the model is, the better the performance of the model is. And the whole area, right, if it's perfectly aligned to the y-axis, the area under the curve is going to have a value of 1, right? If it's a perfect model that did very well, right? So the deviation from that number, from 1, that means that the model is not perfect. And that's what we were expecting. We will never obtain a perfect model. But we got a performance level of 0.9, right? Which is pretty high. It's very close to 1. But again, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And this is just one of the first tests that we did after applying all that that framework. So we're pretty happy with how we define the model, and that means that the factors that we choose for analysis, the variables that we choose for analysis, are making sense. And well, this is another way of kind of evaluating the performance, is by looking at the omission rates. The omission rates is how many pixels or how many observations, how many presence observations were misclassified by the model, right? So in this case, we have omission rate of 0.13. So that means 13% of the observations, the presence observations, were misclassified. So only 13. So that gives you a sense of the error, right? So 13% error, right, in this type of estimations. Now, what I think is more interesting now from a perspective of explaining what's going on is to look at this type of graphics. So these are the partial responses of the variables. So something you also need to think about here is that we're looking at the responses, individual responses, right? But we're not looking at the interaction of all these different variables. So it's looking at each response individually, right, without considering interaction effects among the different variables. So in other words, we look, for example, at distance to forest edge, but we keep the other variables constant. So we just kind of get a sense of what the impact of that particular variable has on the model, right? But later on, we can actually look at the interactions between the different variables and see, which variables are actually contributing something to the model. So in this case, for example, some things that kind of pop out to me or pop out from this graph are some of these relationships, for example, with the type of forest communities. And this is something that we already identified in our previous research, but this is kind of confirming what we already saw earlier, that, for example, distance to evergreen trees is an important factor that contributes to the probability of finding holly. So what this is telling us is that the probability, so here, right, the y-axis shows the actual variable, right, distance to evergreen, and the x-axis shows the probability. So the probability decreases with distance to evergreen. So that means that the farther away you are from an evergreen tree, from a conifer, from a Douglas fir, the less likely is that you're going to find holly. So that means that holly really likes to be close to evergreen trees, right, to Douglas firs, cedars, and so there is that kind of a spatial association between holly and these other big trees. And this is also confirmed by this, right? So if you look at the average height trees, and if you consider that evergreen trees are relatively taller than deciduous trees, for example, that also give us a sense of the preference of holly, right? So here, the farther away you are from, I'm sorry, this is the heights, right? So in other words, the taller the trees, right, the higher the probability of finding holly. So holly appears to prefer those areas where you have big trees, which kind of confirms this association with evergreen communities. There are a couple of more things that I wanted to point out here related, for example, to nutrients, right? It looks like, for example, with nitrogen and phosphorus, the lower, the higher, the lower the concentrations, right? The lower the concentrations of ammonia, the higher the probability of finding holly. The same thing with phosphorus. The higher the probability, the lower the concentrations of phosphorus. And that gives us a sense of how much maybe, and this is something we have to confirm, do more tests, but it looks like holly is uptaking, this type of nutrients from the soils, and they are already depleted. These are depleted, nutrient-depleted soils. Also we need to think that the trees that we mapped were not just established. They're probably been there for a few years, right? So they are likely to have been using this type of nutrients for a while, and that's why you have lower concentrations of this type of nutrients. So that could also give us an indication of the impact of holly on soils. As I said, there's some relationships between temperature and light conditions. Again, the higher the temperatures, the higher the probability of finding holly, the higher the light intensity, also the higher the probability of finding holly. Despite the fact that they are shade tolerant, right, they do prefer areas that are a little bit with a little bit more light intensity. Okay, but again, we're looking at individual responses without looking at the interaction among these different types of variables. Now, this is another output that is important to look at. These are the coefficients, and the size of the coefficient, in other words, how big the number is going to give you a sense of how important that variable is in explaining the presence of holly, right? So the larger the coefficient, again, and this is actually modeling the interactions as well. So once we account for those interactions, these are the variables that actually are left out, right? These are the variables that significantly contribute to our model, right? In the previous image, I was showing everything, right? Everything without considering those type of interactions. But this one is kind of already looking at those interactions and throwing those coefficients that are important to look at. So here, for example, we see, again, this association with tree heights, the association with distance to forest. distance to dieback, that means also distance to where trees are dead. So the dieback is apparently also has some sort of influence in the presence of holly, distance to evergreen, trees, temperature. Now, as you can see here, for example, light intensity didn't come up, right? It's not a significant factor contributing to the presence. Once we take into account all these other factors, light is not an important one. It's not a significant one. Okay, so we still see some correlations with the nutrients components, with topography, slope, and aspect, and also some association with where these plants are, which type of communities are there. For example, evergreen, also this type of dieback, dead trees, and also where you have significant patches of short trees, shrubs, right? That also appears to be affecting the presence of holly. We also need to just consider that these are just preliminary results. We need to do a little bit more reflection on what these numbers actually mean, but we're starting seeing some interesting results, particularly about how all these factors interact with each other and how those interactions affect the presence of holly. Now, in terms of outputs, and I think from a management perspective, this is what I think is interesting to look at. These are the maps that can be used for, from a management perspective to see, okay, here is where holly is likely to show up, is likely to be present in this red area. So the red areas are areas where the probability of finding holly is very high, and these blue areas where the probability of finding holly is very low. So as you can see, right, holly is not all over the place. Right? So there are these type of environmental conditions that determine or influence, right, where you find the highest concentrations of the plant. So it's interesting to see also that kind of a spatial correspondence between what our model predicted and the actual observations that we mapped. So this green cylinders that you see here is the actual trees, and the height of the cylinder is how tall the tree is. Right, so we have a higher concentration of holly here with older trees, and we have some sporadic individuals over here on this side of the park. I don't know if you're familiar with the park. This is the South Ridge Trail. This trail over here, this is the Water Tower Trail over here, and there is another trail that goes all the way to the main entrance road that is over here. This is the field, right? The field. The grassy field, the baseball field, right? So you have a better sense of where you actually can find a lot of holly. So this is another visualization of the same data, but in this case, we're looking at the probability. So the peaks in this case, they don't show, that's not topography, right? The peaks are the probability values. So the higher the peaks, the higher the probability of finding holly, right? So these are areas where the likelihood of finding holly is very high. But also, these areas, these valleys, again, these are not topographic valleys, but also valleys where the probability of finding holly is very low, right? Which kind of associates also with the topography. So there's that kind of correlation with the slope aspect and elevation. All right, so some findings and conclusions. Again, this is all preliminary. But we actually really liking what we see from this model that's called Maxent. So Maxent is proving to be an effective analytical tool that we can rely on to do this type of predictions, especially in situations like ours, where we can only rely on presence data, so we don't have absence data. Data collection efforts are concentrated, again, in some areas and not others, which there is some bias in the way that we collected the data, especially because we are not 100% certain which sites are absent, right? We don't know 100% accuracy. Our model is performing very well with an area under the curve of 0.9 with an omission rate of 13, very close to 0. Which will be perfect, but that's not that we're not trying to do that. we're mostly interested in kind of finding this type of explanatory variables that are helping us make sense of the spatial patterns that we see. And yeah, so environmental conditions, we saw that terrain, soil, vegetation, atmospheric characteristics, they play an important role in explaining where the plant is going to be successful. Phosphorus, ammonia have a negative association with the probability of finding holly. So that means that holly has some effect on nutrient availability in the soils, but we need to do further research and probably have some kind of multi-temporal evaluation of soil nutrients to see how soil nutrients are changing over time with the presence of holly, which is something we didn't do, right? We just this was just a one-time type of collection effort that we did, so we don't have a sense of how these nutrients have changed over time with the presence of holly. And again, so there are some actions that could help to reduce the negative impact of edges, particularly because that's also an important factor. Modifying the edge shapes, restoration along the edges of forests could also help prevent the percolation of holly into these areas where you have good standing forest. Careful monitoring of holly in these areas along the edges could also be important to kind of control the invasion process a little bit. So some of the future research that I think are important questions to ask here is what is going to happen in the future with this, right? So in the context of climate change, for example, since higher temperatures are expected, we're finding a correlation with temperatures, right? Apparently, holly prefers areas or does a little bit better in areas where you have higher temperatures. With temperatures changing at the global level, at the regional level, what is going to happen with holly? How fast is this species going to disperse, right, in the near future? So those are important questions that are going to have to be answered in this context of this global warming. Now, is it possible to move beyond the extent of St. Edward State Park, beyond the side-to-side? So that's another important question, right? I think it's possible. We have a robust model that could be used to make generalizations, but that requires a lot of effort, right? Because we will have to actually measure all these different types of parameters in other areas as well. So we have to be creative in ways that we do our analysis and the way that we collect data, the type of data that we collect, to able to extrapolate our findings to the larger context. And now from a human environment geography, that's also an important questions to ask. I think one is about our culture, right? The culture around holly. So how are residents in Washington State changing their perception of the value of holly now that we have a little bit better understanding of the impacts of this species, how fast this species is spreading? So basically the cultural geography around holly, is that changing, is remaining the same? I think with more knowledge and more experiences like this one, right, we can actually probably change a little bit about that culture around holly that has affected the region for more than a century, right? Changing that culture is probably the hardest. So what are these values, right? What are these cultural, aesthetic, economic values that people see on holly, right? That could pose a barrier in its control eradication of this species. So what attitudes towards English holly management, what are these attitudes around management, right? How managers perceive holly. I know, for example, managers here at St. Edward State Park are really concerned about holly, and they actually have implemented some control programs to not eradicate English holly from the park, but at least control it in some way, right? And maybe Daryl can talk about their efforts of sending crews to the trails to cut the holly and try to control it. That takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources to do that kind of control. But I think it all starts from the culture of holly management, right? It's not just the managers, but the community around these areas that also can contribute to the control of this invasion. All right, so there's some references if you're more interested about learning the different types of approaches. This is the work of Dave and I that was published in this journal, looking at some of these aspects of relationships and trajectories. And I think what you guys saw today is kind of a version 2 of what we did with Dave 10 years ago, with a little bit better data and also a little bit additional data that we were able to incorporate to our analysis. And thank you. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. And again, thank you to UW for their support with the research grant, and also Washington State Parks for allowing us to do this work here at Kenmore State Park.